What happens when the most arrogant student at one of America's most prestigious prep schools thinks he can humiliate the most beloved teacher in front of the entire senior class? Mr. Patterson, with all due respect, your outdated teaching methods are exactly why American education is failing. The words cut through the advanced placement history classroom like a blade. Senior class president Alexander Sterling had just made the biggest mistake of his academic career. He had challenged Professor James Patterson's authority in front of 30 of his peers, knowing full well that every word was being recorded for the school's documentary project about educational excellence. What happened next would become legendary at Westbrook Academy. And what nobody in that classroom knew was that Sterling had been planning this confrontation for weeks, believing he could use the school's prestigious reputation to launch his own path to political stardom. He was about to learn why Professor Patterson had been called the most respected educator in New England for over 3 decades. If you want to see how true leadership handles arrogance and disrespect, you're about to witness a masterclass in educational authority that will leave you speechless. But more importantly, you'll discover how one teacher's response to a student's public humiliation would change not just one young man's life, but the entire culture of one of America's most elite schools. The morning of March 15th started like any other day at Westbrook Academy, the prestigious preparatory school nestled in the hills of Connecticut. Founded in 1889, Westbrook had educated senators, Supreme Court justices, and 3 U.S. presidents. Its Gothic buildings and ivy-covered walls represented everything traditional about American private education, and its $60,000 annual tuition ensured that only the most privileged families could afford to send their children there. Professor James Patterson arrived at his office at 6:30 a.m., as he had every school day for the past 32 years. At 64 years old, he still maintained the energy and intellectual passion that had made him a beloved figure not just at Westbrook, but in academic circles across New England. His advanced placement U.S. history course was legendary among students and parents alike, with a 98% pass rate on the AP exam and college admission officers specifically looking for students who had taken Patterson's history. The classroom was buzzing with its usual mix of anticipation and nervous energy. These were seniors, just 2 months away from graduation, many already accepted to Ivy League universities. What made this day different was the presence of the documentary crew that had been following several classes as part of Westbrook's 135th anniversary celebration. The cameras were capturing what the school marketed as academic excellence in action. What made this day truly different, however, was the presence of Alexander Sterling, the 18-year-old senior class president who had been planning something that would change everything. Sterling was everything Westbrook Academy represented on the surface: wealthy family background, perfect SAT scores, early admission to Harvard, and the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. His father was a prominent Wall Street executive. His mother sat on the boards of 3 major charities, and Alexander had been groomed since childhood to follow in their footsteps of power and influence. For 3 weeks, Sterling had been telling his friends at the exclusive Hartford Club that he was going to show that old history teacher how modern students think. He had studied Professor Patterson's teaching methods, watched videos of his lectures, and convinced himself that the professor's emphasis on primary sources and critical thinking was outdated in the age of Wikipedia and instant information. Sterling's strategy was calculated: create a confrontation on camera, demonstrate his intellectual superiority, and use the viral moment to establish himself as a voice for educational reform before he started at Harvard in the fall. What Sterling didn't know was that Professor Patterson had been teaching history since before Sterling was born. He didn't know that Patterson had written 2 acclaimed books on American constitutional law, had been a consultant for the Smithsonian Institution, and had declined offers to teach at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton because he believed in the mission of secondary education. And he certainly didn't know that beneath the professor's gentle demeanor lay one of the most brilliant academic minds in New England. The lesson that day was about the Constitutional Convention of 1787, specifically the debates between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Professor Patterson had arranged primary source documents from Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison across the students' desks, asking them to analyze the competing visions for American democracy. It was the kind of hands-on, document-based learning that had made his classes famous among college admissions officers. Today, we're going to examine how the founders debated the very issues we still face in American politics, Professor Patterson began, his voice carrying the enthusiasm that had inspired thousands of students over 3 decades. I want you to read Hamilton's Federalist 78 and then consider Jefferson's concerns about federal power. What compromises do you see in the final Constitution? Sterling raised his hand immediately. Professor Patterson, before we dive into 250-year-old documents, don't you think we should be focusing on contemporary political analysis? I mean, these debates are completely irrelevant to modern governance. Professor Patterson looked up from his notes, his expression patient and encouraging. That's an interesting perspective, Alexander. Can you elaborate on why you think understanding the founders' intentions is irrelevant? This was exactly the opening Sterling had been waiting for. He had prepared for this moment, researching modern educational theory and contemporary political science. Professor, with all due respect, your entire approach to history is fundamentally flawed. We're living in the digital age, where information changes hourly. Spending weeks analyzing documents written by slave owners and published in newspapers hardly anyone could read is exactly what's wrong with American education. The classroom fell silent. Even for Westbrook Academy, where intellectual debate was encouraged, Sterling's tone was unusually confrontational. The documentary cameras captured every word, every expression, every moment of tension. Professor Patterson set down his papers and looked directly at Sterling. I appreciate your passion for educational reform, Alexander. Can you suggest what approach you think would be more effective? Sterling stood up, playing to the cameras. We should be studying contemporary leadership models, analyzing current political strategies, understanding how modern democracies actually function. These historical documents are museum pieces. They have nothing to teach us about governing a 21st century superpower. The professor nodded thoughtfully. So you believe that understanding how our democratic institutions were created and why they were designed the way they were has no bearing on how they function today? Exactly, Sterling said, his voice rising with confidence. Mr. Patterson, with all due respect, your outdated teaching methods are exactly why American education is failing. While schools in Singapore and Finland are teaching students to think critically about modern problems, we're stuck memorizing what some dead white guys wrote 3 centuries ago. The silence in the classroom was deafening. Sterling had just publicly insulted Professor Patterson's teaching methods, questioned his relevance, and essentially accused him of educational malpractice in front of cameras that would broadcast this moment to parents, alumni, and prospective students across the country. Professor Patterson slowly walked to his desk, picked up a leather-bound folder, and opened it carefully. His expression hadn't changed, but everyone in the classroom could sense a shift in the atmosphere. When he spoke, his voice remained calm and measured, but there was something underneath that made even Sterling pause. Alexander, I want to make sure I understand your position correctly. Are you telling me that in your opinion studying primary historical sources is a waste of time for college-bound students? Sterling, emboldened by what he mistook for uncertainty, doubled down. Professor Patterson, I'm simply stating that effective education requires modern approaches. Harvard's freshman political science seminars focus on contemporary case studies, not colonial-era documents. Maybe if Westbrook's history department updated its curriculum to reflect current academic standards, our students would be better prepared for university-level work. The insult was clear. Sterling was suggesting that Professor Patterson's methods were not just outdated, but inadequate preparation for the elite universities where Westbrook students were headed. He was questioning the professor's competence in front of his peers and on camera. Professor Patterson nodded slowly. I see. Alexander, before we continue with your suggestions for curriculum reform, I'd like to ask you a few questions about today's lesson. You mentioned that Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison were slave owners writing for an illiterate population. Have you read Federalist 78? Sterling hesitated for just a moment. Professor, as I mentioned, I think we should focus on more relevant material. That's not what I asked, Alexander. Have you read Federalist 78? The question hung in the air. Sterling had been so focused on his prepared arguments about educational philosophy that he hadn't actually read the specific documents Professor Patterson had assigned for today's class. I've studied Hamilton's overall political philosophy, but I don't think memorizing specific papers— Alexander, Professor Patterson interrupted, his voice still calm, but with an edge that made everyone in the room lean forward. You're in my advanced placement history class, commenting on my teaching methods, and you haven't read the assignment. Let me ask you again, have you read Federalist 78? The arrogance began to fade from Sterling's face. No, Professor Patterson, but you thought you could critique my teaching without doing the work. Professor Patterson opened the leather folder on his desk. Federalist 78 is Alexander Hamilton's defense of judicial review, the principle that allows the Supreme Court to declare laws unconstitutional. It's the foundation of how our judicial system works today. He looked directly at Sterling, whose confident posture had begun to slump. Now, Alexander, you mentioned that these documents have nothing to teach us about modern governance. Are you familiar with the Supreme Court case Marbury v. Madison? Sterling's face was beginning to show real concern. Professor, I don't see how a 200-year-old court case— Answer the question, please. Are you familiar with Marbury v. Madison? No, Professor Patterson. Marbury v. Madison, decided in 1803, established the principle of judicial review in American law. Chief Justice John Marshall based his decision directly on Hamilton's arguments in Federalist 78. Professor Patterson pulled out another document. This principle, that courts can overturn laws that violate the Constitution, has been used in every major civil rights case in American history. Brown v. Board of Education, which ended school segregation. Loving v. Virginia, which legalized interracial marriage. Obergefell v. Hodges, which legalized same-sex marriage. The classroom was completely silent, except for the hum of the documentary cameras. Sterling's face had gone from confident to concerned to genuinely worried. Now, Alexander, you suggested that studying Hamilton's museum piece documents is irrelevant to modern governance. How do you think civil rights lawyers arguing before the Supreme Court today prepare their cases? Sterling tried to speak, but no words came out. Professor Patterson wasn't finished. What he said next would not only destroy Sterling's arrogance, but teach everyone watching a lesson about the difference between confidence and competence. Furthermore, Alexander, you mentioned that effective education requires modern approaches, and you specifically criticized my focus on primary sources. I'm curious about your preparation for today's discussion. Did you research the educational background of the Harvard professors you'll be studying with next year? Sterling looked confused. Professor, I don't see the relevance. The relevance, Alexander, is competence. Your freshman political science seminar will be taught by Professor Sarah Williams, who received her PhD from Columbia in 2003. Her dissertation was titled Primary Source Analysis in Democratic Theory, From Federalist Papers to Modern Constitutional Interpretation. Her entire academic career is built on exactly the kind of document-based analysis you just called obsolete. Sterling's face was now visibly red. He was beginning to realize that his research had been woefully inadequate. Additionally, Professor Patterson continued, the head of Harvard's political science department is Professor Michael Chen, who wrote the definitive modern analysis of Federalist 78. His book, Hamilton's Legacy, Judicial Review in Contemporary American Politics, is required reading in constitutional law courses at 17 major universities. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Sterling hadn't just attacked Professor Patterson's methods. He had unknowingly criticized the exact approach used by the Harvard professors he would study with in 6 months. So let me understand this, Alexander. You came into my classroom, insulted my teaching methods, claimed that primary source analysis is obsolete, but you didn't know that the Harvard professors you'll study with next year built their careers on exactly these approaches. Sterling tried to speak, but Professor Patterson held up his hand. I'm not finished, Alexander. You also mentioned schools in Singapore and Finland. I assume you've researched their curricula? The question was clearly rhetorical, but Sterling's silence confirmed that he hadn't. Singapore's Advanced Placement History program requires students to analyze primary sources from multiple historical periods. Finland's university preparation courses spend entire semesters on document-based historical analysis. The modern approaches you praised actually emphasize primary source work more heavily than American schools, not less. Each revelation hit like a physical blow. Sterling had constructed his entire argument on assumptions that were not just wrong, but the exact opposite of reality. Professor Patterson walked to the whiteboard and wrote down a series of dates and names. Alexander, you suggested that studying dead white guys from 3 centuries ago is irrelevant. Let me share something with you. The constitutional principles we're discussing today were cited in Supreme Court cases decided this year, this month, this week. He turned back to Sterling, who stood frozen at his desk. Monday, the Supreme Court heard arguments in a First Amendment case. Both sides cited Federalist 78. Tuesday, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals overturned a federal regulation based on principles from Jefferson's letters to Madison. Yesterday, the Attorney General of Massachusetts filed a brief in a voting rights case that quotes directly from the anti-federalist papers we studied last week. The devastation was complete, but Professor Patterson wasn't done. What he said next would change not just Sterling's understanding of history, but his entire approach to learning and life. Now, Alexander, you suggested that my Suffolk University education wasn't adequate for preparing Westbrook students for elite universities. Let me share something with you that might surprise you. Professor Patterson walked to his bookshelf and pulled down a heavy volume. This is the Harvard Guide to Undergraduate Studies published this year. It lists the high schools that have produced the most successful Harvard freshmen over the past decade. Westbrook Academy ranks 3rd nationally. He opened to a specific page. It also lists the individual high school teachers whose students show the highest rates of academic success at Harvard. I've been in the top 5 for 8 consecutive years. Sterling's mouth opened slightly, but no words emerged. Furthermore, Professor Patterson continued, last year, Harvard's admissions office sent me a formal letter thanking me for the preparation my students receive. They specifically praised our focus on primary source analysis and critical thinking skills. 3 Harvard professors have audited my classes to understand why Westbrook students perform so well in their courses. The professor's voice remained gentle, but each word carried the weight of undeniable truth. Alexander, the outdated methods you criticized are the reason Harvard accepted you. The admissions officer who reviewed your application told me personally that your essay analyzing Federalist 10 was what distinguished you from other applicants. The realization hit Sterling like a physical blow. His Harvard admission essay had been based directly on work from Professor Patterson's class. But here's what troubles me most, Alexander, Professor Patterson said, his voice taking on the tone of a disappointed mentor. In all my years of teaching, I've learned that education isn't about memorizing facts or even mastering analytical skills. It's about developing intellectual humility, the recognition that learning is a lifelong process and that every source of knowledge deserves respect. He looked directly at Sterling, who stood with his head beginning to bow. What you've demonstrated today isn't intellectual confidence. It's intellectual arrogance. And that kind of arrogance will limit your learning for the rest of your life. The classroom was so quiet that the documentary cameras seemed intrusive, capturing a moment that had become far more serious than anyone had anticipated. "Alexander," Professor Patterson said, opening Sterling's academic file, "you're an exceptional student. Your analytical papers are among the best I've read in 3 decades of teaching. Your insights into historical patterns show genuine intellectual promise. But intelligence without humility becomes arrogance, and arrogance, Alexander, is the enemy of wisdom." Sterling looked up, his earlier confidence completely shattered. What happened next would not only change his life, but create a legendary moment in Westbrook Academy history. Professor Patterson walked back to his desk and sat down, his expression remaining calm but serious. "Alexander, I'm going to do something now that might surprise you. Despite your unprofessional conduct and uninformed criticism, I'm going to give you an opportunity to demonstrate the intellectual capacity I know you possess." Sterling looked up hopefully. "I'm assigning you an independent research project. Over the next 4 weeks, you will trace the influence of one founding-era document on 5 major Supreme Court decisions from the past decade. You will analyze how contemporary legal scholars interpret historical sources. You will interview 3 college professors about their use of primary source materials, and you will present your findings to the entire senior class." The assignment was clearly designed to prove exactly why Professor Patterson's methods were essential, but Sterling nodded quickly. "Yes, Professor Patterson. Thank you, Professor Patterson. I'm not finished, Alexander. You will also write a formal analysis of why primary source study is essential for understanding contemporary politics. Not because your words today hurt my feelings, but because intellectual integrity is fundamental to education. You will demonstrate that you understand the difference between confident ignorance and informed opinion." Professor Patterson's voice remained steady, but there was steel underneath. "Furthermore, Alexander, if you continue to demonstrate the intellectual arrogance you've shown today, if you disrespect your classmates' learning process, or if you enter college with the assumption that you have nothing left to learn, you will discover that Harvard is full of students who combine intelligence with humility. They will leave you behind." The threat wasn't about grades or graduation. It was about Sterling's entire future academic and professional success. "Do I make myself clear, Alexander?" "Perfectly clear, Professor Patterson." Professor Patterson looked out at the stunned classroom, at the cameras that had captured every moment of this exchange, at the students who would remember this lesson long after they had forgotten specific historical facts. "Let this be a lesson to everyone in this room," he said, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades of educational experience. "Education is not about demonstrating how smart you are. It's about discovering how much you still need to learn. The moment you think you know everything about a subject is the moment you stop growing intellectually." He looked back at Sterling, who stood with genuine humility for perhaps the first time in his academic career. "In this classroom, I don't care if you're going to Harvard or community college. I don't care if your family built a library at this school or if you're here on scholarship. I care about intellectual curiosity. I care about respect for knowledge. I care about the humility to recognize that every text, every document, every historical source has something to teach us." Professor Patterson picked up his syllabus. "Alexander, use the next 4 weeks wisely. Learn to research with genuine curiosity instead of seeking to confirm your assumptions. Learn to listen to sources that challenge your preconceptions. And learn that true intelligence shows itself through questions, not through certainty." The class period ended, but the impact of what had happened would extend far beyond those 50 minutes. What occurred in the following weeks would prove why Professor Patterson's approach to education had made him legendary at Westbrook Academy, and why his influence on students extended far beyond the classroom. As the other students filed out, many stopping to quietly apologize to Professor Patterson for Sterling's behavior, Alexander remained at his desk, staring down at the primary source documents he hadn't bothered to read. The arrogance that had carried him through 4 years at Westbrook, through standardized tests, through college applications, had been systematically dismantled by a 64-year-old teacher who had never raised his voice. Sarah Chen, the valedictorian and Sterling's closest academic rival, stopped at his desk as she gathered her papers. "Alex," she said quietly, "a word of advice. Professor Patterson is the most knowledgeable and respected teacher at Westbrook. If you had spent half as much time preparing for today's discussion as you did planning your performance for the cameras, you would have avoided this humiliation." Sterling looked up at her. How did he know all that? The Supreme Court cases, the Harvard professors, the international curricula? Sarah smiled sadly. "Because he does his homework, Alex. Always. Professor Patterson reads every major Supreme Court decision, every significant historical scholarship publication, every educational research study. He knows more about how colleges evaluate our preparation than most college professors do. You thought you could embarrass him on camera. He's been dealing with overconfident students for longer than we've been alive." As Sterling walked out of the classroom, the documentary crew followed him, capturing his defeat for what would become one of the most viewed educational videos in Westbrook Academy's history. His phone buzzed with messages from classmates who had watched the live stream from other classes. The video of his intellectual humiliation would be viewed over 500,000 times in the first week, shared by educators across the country as an example of the difference between confidence and competence. But the real impact was felt throughout Westbrook Academy's academic culture. Within days, students were spending extra time actually reading assigned materials before participating in class discussions. The Academic Honor Society organized seminars on intellectual humility. Senior students who had heard about Sterling's public humiliation began approaching their final projects with unprecedented seriousness and preparation. The documentary crew, originally planning to showcase Westbrook's academic excellence, found themselves with something far more powerful, a real-time demonstration of how true education works, how intellectual arrogance is addressed, and how a master teacher handles a student's public challenge with dignity and effectiveness. 4 weeks later, Sterling presented his research project to the entire senior class. He looked different, humbler, more thoughtful, genuinely engaged with his material. He had spent over 100 hours researching the influence of Federalist 78 on contemporary legal decisions. He had interviewed professors at Harvard, Yale, and Columbia about their use of historical sources. He had analyzed Supreme Court decisions from the past year and traced their intellectual foundations back to founding-era documents. When he presented his findings, Sterling began with an acknowledgement that surprised everyone. 4 weeks ago, I demonstrated what Professor Patterson calls confident ignorance, the assumption that I could critique something I didn't understand. Today, I want to share what I've learned about why primary source analysis isn't just relevant to contemporary politics. It's essential. What followed was the most sophisticated academic presentation any Westbrook student had delivered in years. Sterling traced the intellectual lineage from Hamilton's Federalist 78 through Marshall's decision in Marbury versus Madison to the Supreme Court's decision 3 weeks earlier in a religious freedom case. He demonstrated how contemporary legal scholars rely on historical documents not as museum pieces, but as living foundations for modern constitutional interpretation. Professor Patterson listened with genuine pride as Sterling concluded, "I want to apologize not just to Professor Patterson, but to my classmates for my intellectual arrogance 4 weeks ago. I learned that true academic confidence comes not from assuming you know everything, but from developing the skills to learn anything. The primary source analysis we do in this classroom isn't preparation for college, it is college-level work." After the presentation, Professor Patterson called Sterling aside. "Alexander, that was exceptional academic work. You demonstrated exactly what I hoped you would learn, that intellectual humility opens doors that arrogance closes. You researched with genuine curiosity, engaged with sources that challenged your assumptions, and presented your findings with both confidence and humility. Sterling felt something he hadn't experienced since elementary school. Genuine pride in learning for its own sake, not just for grades or recognition. But the story was far from over. What happened at graduation 2 months later would become the most talked-about moment in Westbrook Academy's modern history and would cement Professor Patterson's reputation as not just an exceptional teacher, but a transformative educator. Graduation day at Westbrook Academy was always a spectacular affair. Families traveled from across the country to watch their children receive diplomas worth more than many people's annual salaries. The ceremony took place on the school's historic quad, with graduates in traditional caps and gowns, faculty in academic regalia, and parents in their finest formal wear. As senior class president, Sterling was scheduled to deliver the student commencement address. He had written and rewritten his speech dozens of times, focusing on themes of intellectual growth, humility, and the responsibility that comes with educational privilege. But as he sat on the stage, looking out at his classmates and their families, he realized that his public humiliation 4 weeks earlier had changed more than just his approach to learning. It had changed his entire understanding of leadership and responsibility. When the time came for student recognition, Headmaster Williams began reading the traditional awards. Valedictorian, Sarah Chen. Salutatorian, Marcus Rodriguez. Outstanding Achievement in Sciences, Jennifer Park. Outstanding Achievement in Mathematics, David Thompson. Then came the award that everyone had expected Sterling to receive, Outstanding Achievement in Social Studies. This award traditionally went to the student who had demonstrated exceptional performance in history, government, and economics courses. Sterling had maintained a perfect GPA in social studies throughout his 4 years at Westbrook. Everyone assumed his name would be called. The Outstanding Achievement in Social Studies Award, Headmaster Williams announced, recognizes not just academic excellence, but intellectual growth, scholarly integrity, and the kind of learning that extends beyond the classroom. Sterling sat up straighter, preparing to walk to the podium. This year's recipient demonstrated that true academic achievement comes not from never making mistakes, but from learning so profoundly from those mistakes that they transform both themselves and their classmates. This student showed us that intellectual humility is more valuable than intellectual arrogance, and that the greatest learning happens when we acknowledge how much we still don't know. The description was clearly about Sterling's transformation over the past month, but something in the headmaster's tone made him pause. The Outstanding Achievement in Social Studies Award goes to Marcus Rodriguez. The silence was deafening. Sterling felt as if the air had been sucked out of his lungs. Marcus Rodriguez was an excellent student, but Sterling had the higher GPA, the more impressive research project, the more visible academic profile. How could his name not be called? As Marcus walked to the podium to accept his award, Sterling's mind raced. This had to be a mistake, an administrative error. There was no way that after his academic transformation, after his exceptional research project, after Professor Patterson's praise for his work, he could be overlooked for the one award he had been counting on. But as the ceremony continued, Sterling's name was not called for any major academic recognition. Outstanding Achievement in Leadership went to Sarah Chen. The Citizenship Award went to Jennifer Park. The Academic Excellence Award went to David Thompson. Student of the Year went to Marcus Rodriguez. Sterling sat in stunned silence as his classmates received recognition after recognition. He had expected this graduation to be his moment of redemption, proof that his intellectual transformation had been recognized and rewarded. Instead, he was watching his peers, students he had always considered his academic equals or inferiors, receive the honors he had assumed were his. When the ceremony ended and families gathered for photos and congratulations, Sterling sought out Professor Patterson. He found his teacher near the faculty reception area, surrounded by parents thanking him for his influence on their children. "Professor Patterson," Sterling said when the crowd thinned, "could I speak with you privately?" They walked to a quiet corner of the quad, away from the graduation celebrations. "Professor, I don't understand," Sterling began, his voice tight with confusion and disappointment. "I thought after my research project, after my presentation, after everything I learned, I thought my academic transformation would be recognized today." Professor Patterson looked at Sterling with the same gentle expression he had worn throughout their classroom confrontation 2 months earlier. "Alexander, what kind of recognition were you expecting? The Social Studies Award, at least. Maybe Student of the Year? I had the highest GPA in the department. My research project was the most sophisticated presentation in class history. You said yourself that my work was exceptional." Professor Patterson nodded slowly. "Your work was exceptional, Alexander. Your intellectual growth over the past 2 months has been remarkable. You've demonstrated exactly the kind of learning that education is supposed to foster. Then why wasn't I recognized today? Why did my name get forgotten at graduation?" The question hung in the air between them. Professor Patterson was quiet for a long moment, watching the families celebrating around them. "Alexander," he said finally, "let me ask you something. Why did you want those awards?" Sterling was caught off guard by the question. Because I earned them. Because I worked hard. Because I transformed myself academically." "But why did you want them?" Sterling struggled to articulate what seemed obvious. "Because they represent recognition for academic achievement. Because they show that my learning was valued. Because they're important for my future." Professor Patterson smiled sadly. "Alexander, you just answered your own question about why your name wasn't called today." Sterling looked confused. 2 months ago, you created a public spectacle in my classroom because you wanted recognition for your intelligence. You challenged my teaching methods not because you wanted to learn, but because you wanted to demonstrate your superiority. Even after your intellectual transformation, even after your exceptional research project, you're still focused on external recognition rather than internal growth." The words hit Sterling like a physical blow. "The students who received awards today," Professor Patterson continued, "have spent 4 years learning for the sake of learning. Marcus Rodriguez has tutored struggling students every week for 2 years, not for credit or recognition, but because he believes everyone deserves educational support. Sarah Chen has organized study groups and helped classmates with difficult concepts since freshman year. Jennifer Park has volunteered at the local elementary school, teaching science to underprivileged children." Sterling felt his face burning with embarrassment. "Your research project was brilliant, Alexander. Your presentation was sophisticated and insightful. Your intellectual growth has been extraordinary, but until 2 months ago, all of your academic work was motivated by personal recognition. The other students have been motivated by genuine curiosity and service to others." Professor Patterson's voice remained gentle, but his message was clear. Academic awards aren't just about intelligence or even academic performance. They're about character. They're about why you learn and how you use your learning to benefit others. Sterling stared at the ground, feeling the same humiliation he had experienced in the classroom 2 months earlier, but this time the lesson was even more profound. "Alexander, your name wasn't forgotten at graduation. Your name wasn't called because your motivations are still focused on yourself, rather than on how your education can serve others. The students who received recognition today have spent their entire Westbrook careers asking not, 'How can I prove how smart I am?' but, 'How can I use my learning to help others?'" The silence stretched between them as Sterling processed this revelation. "But here's what I want you to understand," Professor Patterson continued. This isn't the end of your story. This is the beginning. You have 4 years at Harvard ahead of you. You can spend those years continuing to seek recognition for your intelligence, or you can spend them learning how to use your intelligence in service of something larger than yourself. Sterling looked up, his eyes reflecting genuine understanding for the first time. The choice you make will determine not just whether you receive awards and recognition in college, but whether you become the kind of person who deserves them. Intelligence without character is just sophisticated selfishness. Intelligence with character can change the world. Professor Patterson placed a hand on Sterling's shoulder. Alexander, you have exceptional intellectual gifts. You've proven that you can grow and learn from your mistakes. Now the question is, what are you going to do with those gifts? Are you going to use them to impress people, or are you going to use them to serve people? Sterling stood quietly for several minutes, watching his classmates celebrate with their families, seeing them in a completely new light. Marcus Rodriguez was surrounded by younger students from the community tutoring program he had founded. Sarah Chen was being thanked by parents whose children she had helped with college applications. Jennifer Park was showing her science fair project to elementary school students who had come to watch her graduate. For the first time, Sterling understood what he had been missing throughout his academic career. These students hadn't just been his competitors, they had been his teachers, demonstrating through their actions what it meant to use education in service of others. Professor Patterson, Sterling said finally, I understand now. I've been learning for myself instead of learning for others. I've been seeking recognition instead of seeking ways to contribute. Professor Patterson nodded. That's exactly right, Alexander. And recognizing that is the most important lesson you could learn before college. Sterling looked at his teacher with genuine gratitude. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for teaching me that intelligence without humility is worthless, and that academic achievement without service to others is just intellectual masturbation. Professor Patterson smiled. Alexander, you've learned more in the past 2 months than many people learn in 4 years of college. You've discovered that true education isn't about proving how much you know. It's about discovering how much good you can do with what you learn. As the graduation celebration continued around them, Sterling made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. Instead of spending the summer before Harvard focused on preparing to impress his professors, he would volunteer at the local community center, tutoring students who couldn't afford private education. Instead of joining exclusive clubs and societies at college, he would seek out opportunities to use his education in service of others. 6 months later, Sterling would send Professor Patterson a letter from Harvard describing how his approach to learning had changed not just his academic performance, but his relationships with classmates, his choice of extracurricular activities, and his long-term career goals. He had discovered that when learning is motivated by service rather than recognition, both the learning and the recognition become more meaningful. 4 years later, when Sterling graduated from Harvard with a degree in public policy, he would deliver a commencement address that quoted extensively from Professor Patterson's lessons about intellectual humility and service. He would establish a scholarship fund at Westbrook Academy for students who demonstrated not just academic excellence, but commitment to using their education to help others. 10 years later, as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford studying international development, Sterling would write an academic paper about educational philosophy that credited his high school history teacher with teaching him the most important lesson of his academic career, that the purpose of education is not to prove how smart you are, but to discover how much good you can do. The story of Alexander Sterling's public humiliation and private transformation became legendary at Westbrook Academy, but not for the reasons he had originally intended. It became a story about how true education works, how character is more important than intelligence, how service is more valuable than recognition, and how the best teachers don't just transfer knowledge, they transform lives. But the most profound impact of that March morning wasn't on Sterling alone. The documentary footage of Professor Patterson's masterful handling of Sterling's arrogance became one of the most widely viewed educational videos in American academic circles. Education schools across the country used it as a teaching tool, showing future teachers how to respond to student challenges with dignity, knowledge, and transformative purpose. The video was particularly powerful because it captured something rarely seen in educational media: the real-time transformation of a student's understanding of what education actually means. Viewers could watch Sterling's confidence crumble as he realized the depth of his ignorance, then see it rebuild on a foundation of genuine humility and curiosity rather than arrogance and performance. Professor Patterson received letters from teachers around the world, thanking him for demonstrating that educational authority comes not from power or intimidation, but from superior preparation, genuine expertise, and unwavering commitment to student growth. The video became required viewing in educational leadership programs, cited in academic papers about classroom management, and shared by administrators seeking to understand how great teachers handle difficult situations. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from Sterling's Harvard professors, who contacted Professor Patterson during Sterling's freshman year to understand why their new student approached learning so differently from his peers. They described a young man who asked more questions than he answered, who sought out the most challenging research projects, and who spent his free time tutoring fellow students rather than competing with them. "Whatever you taught Alexander Sterling about learning," Professor Williams from Harvard wrote, "it wasn't just academic content. You taught him how to be a scholar in the truest sense, someone who learns not to demonstrate superiority, but to serve others more effectively." The transformation wasn't limited to Sterling. The entire culture at Westbrook Academy shifted in the months following that March confrontation. Students began approaching their classes differently, focusing more on genuine understanding than on performance for grades. Teachers reported higher levels of intellectual engagement, more thoughtful questions, and less competitive pressure in their classrooms. The school's administration, recognizing the power of what Professor Patterson had demonstrated, instituted new programs focused on intellectual humility and service learning. Every senior was required to complete a community service project that applied their academic learning to real-world problems. The Honor Society began recognizing students not just for academic achievement, but for using their knowledge to help others. 5 years after the incident, Westbrook Academy's college placement statistics showed remarkable improvement, but more importantly, feedback from universities indicated that Westbrook graduates were standing out not just for their academic preparation, but for their intellectual maturity, collaborative spirit, and commitment to using their education constructively. The ripple effects extended beyond Westbrook's campus. Other elite preparatory schools began examining their own cultures, asking whether they were producing students who viewed education as a competition to be won or as a tool for service. Some instituted similar programs emphasizing intellectual humility. Others brought Professor Patterson as a consultant to help them understand how to foster both academic excellence and character development. Sterling's story became a case study in educational psychology programs, examining how public failure can become the foundation for profound personal growth when handled by a skilled educator. Researchers analyzed Professor Patterson's response, identifying the key elements that made his intervention so effective. He never attacked Sterling personally. He focused on the gap between Sterling's claims and his actual knowledge. He provided specific examples rather than general criticisms, and he offered a path forward rather than simply punishing the mistake. Most importantly, Professor Patterson had treated Sterling's arrogance not as a character flaw to be condemned, but as an educational opportunity to be transformed. He had recognized that beneath Sterling's obnoxious behavior was a genuinely intelligent young person who had simply never learned the difference between knowledge and wisdom. The documentary crew, originally planning to create a simple promotional video for Westbrook Academy, found themselves with material for a full-length educational film. The humility lesson: how great teachers transform arrogance into wisdom, premiered at educational conferences across the country, and was eventually distributed to schools internationally. The film's most powerful segment was an interview with Sterling 3 years later as a Harvard junior. Asked about the most important lesson he had learned in his educational career, he didn't mention any specific academic content. Instead, he talked about the morning Professor Patterson taught him that true intelligence shows itself through questions, not answers. "I spent my entire high school career trying to prove I was the smartest person in the room," Sterling reflected. "Professor Patterson taught me that the smartest person in the room is the one who knows how much they still need to learn. That lesson changed not just how I approach academics, but how I approach life." The interviewer asked Sterling about the graduation day when his name wasn't called for academic awards. Sterling smiled, a genuinely happy expression, very different from the arrogant smirk he had worn in Professor Patterson's classroom years earlier. "Not receiving those awards was the best thing that could have happened to me," he said. "It taught me that recognition follows character, not the other way around. When you focus on doing good work for the right reasons, recognition takes care of itself. When you focus on recognition first, you miss the point of the work entirely." Sterling went on to describe how this lesson had influenced his college experience. Instead of joining exclusive social clubs or prestigious academic societies, he had founded a tutoring program for first-generation college students. Rather than competing with classmates for professors' attention, he had organized study groups that helped everyone succeed. His academic record was actually better than it had been in high school, but the motivation was entirely different. "The paradox Professor Patterson taught me," Sterling explained, "is that when you stop trying to prove you're smart, you actually become smarter. When you start learning for the sake of others instead of for the sake of yourself, you learn more deeply and more meaningfully." The documentary included interviews with other Westbrook students who had witnessed Sterling's transformation. Many described how his example had influenced their own approach to learning. Sarah Chen, the valedictorian, noted that Sterling's public humiliation had made the entire class more aware of the difference between intellectual confidence and intellectual arrogance. "Watching Alex get intellectually demolished by Professor Patterson was scary," she admitted. "But watching him rebuild his approach to learning was inspiring. It showed all of us that being wrong isn't the end of the world. It's the beginning of real learning." Marcus Rodriguez, who had received the Social Studies Award Sterling had expected, offered perhaps the most insightful commentary. "Alex always had more raw intelligence than most of us. But intelligence without humility is like a powerful car without brakes. It might get you places faster, but it's going to crash eventually." Professor Patterson taught Alex how to put brakes on his intelligence, how to steer it in the right direction. The film's final segment featured Professor Patterson reflecting on his decades of teaching and what the Sterling incident had represented. Sitting in his classroom after school, surrounded by the historical documents and books that had made his teaching so effective, he offered his perspective on what education should accomplish. "Every teacher encounters students like Alexander Sterling," he said. "Brilliant young people who have been praised for their intelligence so much that they've forgotten intelligence is a tool, not a destination. My job isn't to deflate their confidence. It's to redirect their confidence toward worthy goals." He paused, looking out the window at students walking across Westbrook's historic campus. "The greatest tragedy in education isn't students who struggle to learn. It's students who are capable of learning, but who learn for the wrong reasons." Alexander was heading toward a life of intellectual accomplishment without intellectual purpose. My confrontation with him wasn't about teaching him history. It was about teaching him why history matters. Professor Patterson's final comment in the documentary became one of the most quoted educational statements of the decade. The goal of education isn't to produce students who know everything. It's to produce students who want to keep learning everything and who want to use what they learn to make the world better. 7 years after the incident, Sterling returned to Westbrook Academy as the commencement speaker for his former classmates' younger siblings. His address, titled "The Gift of Intellectual Humility," was attended by over 1,000 people, including many educators who had seen the documentary and wanted to hear Sterling's perspective on his transformation. Standing at the same podium where he had once expected to receive academic awards, Sterling delivered a speech that was both deeply personal and broadly inspiring. He talked about the morning he thought he was going to embarrass his history teacher, and instead learned the most important lesson of his life. "Professor Patterson didn't just teach me about the Constitution," Sterling told the graduating seniors. "He taught me about character. He showed me that true leadership comes not from proving you're smarter than everyone else, but from using your intelligence to lift everyone else up." Sterling's speech included practical advice for the graduates about approaching college and careers with intellectual humility. He encouraged them to seek out professors who would challenge their assumptions, to choose friends who would make them think harder rather than feel superior, and to pursue careers that would use their education in service of others. But the most powerful moment of his address came when he invited Professor Patterson to join him at the podium. The 71-year-old teacher, now nearing retirement, received a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. "Professor Patterson," Sterling said, "I want to thank you publicly for saving my intellectual life. You could have simply punished my arrogance. Instead, you transformed it into wisdom. You could have focused on my disrespect. Instead, you focused on my potential. You taught me that the best teachers don't just transfer knowledge, they transform character." Sterling then announced that he was establishing the Patterson Prize for Intellectual Humility, an annual award for Westbrook students who demonstrated not just academic excellence, but the kind of learning that serves others. The first recipient would be chosen not by grades or test scores, but by examples of using education to benefit their community. Professor Patterson, visibly moved by the recognition, offered brief remarks that captured the essence of his teaching philosophy. "Alexander Sterling taught me as much as I taught him. He reminded me that every student, no matter how arrogant or difficult, has the potential for transformation. Our job as educators isn't to judge students for where they start. It's to help them become who they're capable of becoming." The ceremony concluded with Sterling presenting Professor Patterson with a leather-bound collection of letters from students whose lives had been changed by his teaching. The book included notes from senators, doctors, teachers, scientists, and activists around the world, all crediting Professor Patterson with teaching them not just academic content, but life lessons about humility, service, and the true purpose of education. As the graduation ceremony ended and families gathered for photos and celebrations, Sterling found himself in a position very different from his own graduation 7 years earlier. Instead of feeling disappointed about recognition he hadn't received, he felt genuinely grateful for the lesson he had learned. Instead of being focused on his own achievements, he was focused on how he could help the graduating students avoid the mistakes he had made. The story of Alexander Sterling and Professor Patterson had become more than just a cautionary tale about arrogance in the classroom. It had become a powerful example of how education at its best works, not through punishment or humiliation, but through challenging students to become better versions of themselves. The final chapter of the story was still being written in the lives of students around the world who had seen the documentary, heard Sterling's speeches, or learned from teachers inspired by Professor Patterson's example. The lesson that intellectual humility is more valuable than intellectual arrogance was spreading through educational communities, changing how teachers approached difficult students and how students approached learning. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the relationship between Sterling and Professor Patterson themselves. They had remained in close contact over the years, with Sterling often seeking his former teacher's advice on major life decisions. Their correspondence, later donated to Westbrook Academy's archives, revealed the deep mutual respect that had grown from that confrontational March morning. In his final letter to Professor Patterson, written on the 10th anniversary of their classroom confrontation, Sterling reflected on how that moment had shaped everything that followed. "You taught me that real education begins the moment you realize how much you don't know. You showed me that true intelligence is measured not by how many questions you can answer, but by how many better questions you can ask. Most importantly, you demonstrated that the purpose of learning isn't to elevate yourself above others, but to elevate others alongside yourself." Professor Patterson's response, the last letter in their collection, captured the essence of what great teaching accomplishes. "Alexander, watching your transformation over these 10 years has been one of the great privileges of my career. You've proven that intellectual humility isn't a limitation on learning, it's the foundation for lifelong growth. You've shown that character and intelligence together can accomplish what neither can accomplish alone. Most importantly, you've demonstrated that the best students become teachers themselves, passing on not just knowledge, but wisdom." The story of that March morning at Westbrook Academy became a timeless reminder that in education, as in life, the most important lessons are often learned not when we're at our best, but when we're forced to confront our worst impulses and choose to become better. Alexander Sterling's public humiliation had become the foundation for a life of private satisfaction and public service, all because one great teacher understood that the goal of education isn't to prove students wrong, but to help them become right. And in classrooms around the world, teachers facing their own versions of arrogant students continue to remember Professor Patterson's example. That true educational authority comes not from the power to humiliate, but from the wisdom to transform, and that the greatest gift a teacher can give a student isn't the right answer, but the humility to keep asking better questions.